Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma Informed Church Kid podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. So let's do a recap of where we've gotten so far in the biblical narrative. Adonai created the cosmos as a temple, placed humans in the center as the hinge point of all creation, the creatures he designated as his images by their nature, and designed to grow into his likeness. However, we saw them fail that vocation with the series of three falls: the subjection to death, the surrender to depravity, the slavery to demons. Adonai's response to this is to choose one man to be the father of the faithful. His family would become a new nation who would be the healing of all creation and would carry forward the promise of the seed of a woman who would bring deliverance from the venom of the serpent. That family wound up in slavery to Egypt, where Adonai redeemed them by judging the gods of the nations, marking them with blood as his own possession. And then finally, the mixed multitude of this family is brought to Sinai, where the bride of Adonai was given the house rules, or his Torah, as a means to begin this long, slow process of undoing a mindset steeped in trauma, both ancient and primeval, as well as recent and physical, and replace that mindset with a freed and healed mindset of sonship, by showing the heart of God to the family of Abraham, so that they could fulfill their destiny as the seed of Abraham, the faithful ones, who would become the vehicle for the healing of the whole cosmos, beginning by healing themselves. And a necessary step there is to set them apart from all the nations. Unfortunately, just like we saw in the primeval narrative, the designated recipients of Adonai's blessing failed again, repeating all three falls in miniature: idolatry, immorality, and ultimately the loss, yet again, of the possibility of immortality. As a result, Adonai's face or presence stepped back from their midst to avoid destroying them, not because of his heart being angry at them, but because of their heart being stubborn and hard. However, he refused to abandon them. He offered them the easier path, his son leading them. Moses refused and chose the harder path, the dangerous presence in their midst. And because of this act of brave faithfulness, Adonai showed them the clearest picture yet of his heart that is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and always faithful, no matter what, overflowing with the love that never stops loving, forgiving their faults and failures, if only they will repent and return to him. So why did I recap the entire Bible up to this point? Well, it's because at this point in our season, we are at the end of the narrative portion of Exodus and Leviticus. Very little else happens in terms of plot from here on out this season. And for the remainder of this season of the podcast, we will stay right here at Sinai and unpack the entirety of Adonai's Torah. Yes, that's right. It's now time for the book of Leviticus. This is everyone's favorite book in the Bible. This is the place where reading plans go to die. And I say that, of course, quite tongue-in-cheek because I love Leviticus. I find it a fascinating and beautiful text. And frankly, I find it to be a shame that most people don't love Leviticus as I do, because the entire point of it is to restore, in part, the garden condition. That's why I went all the way back to the beginning, to recover the seemingly lost destiny of humankind, to become divine, to be transformed into the likeness of Adonai, sons of God, equal to the angels, as a gift from the hand of the loving Father, the one who has endured all of their falls, who has rescued them from slavery, who has put up with rebellion and infidelity, and who has, despite this, never given up on the family of Abraham. As we wade through Leviticus, it can be very easy to lose sight of the beauty of that promise in all of these arcane details which seem obscure and ancient and often unnecessarily bloody. But when we clearly frame Leviticus as part of Adonai's rescue plan, to heal human nature of its disease, and from that state of health to empower them to be the healing for the cosmos, then Leviticus seems much more relatable and much more glorious. I won't lie to you, it can still be hard to understand. As a result, I will be using lots of visual aids throughout the rest of the season. So, because of that, I would encourage you to watch the remainder of these episodes of the podcast on YouTube to get the full effect and to have the most clear presentation of the content. There is a subscribe link, which I will leave in the show notes for my channel. But overall, this is my hope for the rest of the season, to show you all why Leviticus mattered then and why it still matters today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. Quote, "You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean." End quote. This is going to be our central text for the next 2 episodes, and in many ways, at least on the functional level, is the entire rationale for all of the Torah which Adonai gives his people, to make a distinction between these 2 opposing categories. We will do 1 episode on the distinction between holy and common. That will be today's. And then next week's will be on the distinction between purity and impurity. I'm toying with the possibility of doing some nerd alert episodes to kind of dig deeper into the details. Let me know in the comments if you think that would be valuable. But today's episode and tomorrow's are going to be 30,000 foot high level overviews. So if you want to know how this works out in very specific practice or in specific texts, let me know. So let's look at the definition. What is holiness? Here's one from modern day scholar Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Quote, "If God were always visible, humans could not exist at all. No one can see me and live, says God. If we continue to hear the voice of God, we will die, says the Israelites at Sinai. But if God is always invisible, hidden, imperceptible, then what difference does his existence make? It will always be as if he were not there. The answer to that dilemma is holiness." Quick pause on the quote. That is exactly why I led into this episode with the episode about the face of God, because the encounter of Moses with Adonai on Mount Sinai gives us the dilemma that Leviticus resolves. Because the Israelite assembly, through their representative mediator, has chosen the harder path to have the divine presence smack dab in the middle of the camp, they have chosen to make the infinite present within the finite. They have chosen to make the invisible become visible and tangible and concrete. Let's go ahead and return to Rabbi Sachs. Quote, "Holiness represents those points in space and time where God becomes vivid, tangible, and a felt presence. Holiness is a break in the self-sufficiency of the material world, where infinity enters space and eternity enters time. The universe is the space God makes for man. The holy is the space man makes for God. The secular is the emptiness created by God to be filled by a finite universe. The holy is the emptiness in time and space vacated by humans so that it can be filled by the infinite presence of God." End quote. So what we see there is that holiness is to be set apart from the everyday space-time world of decay and death. Now, not that being a part of this world is bad in a moral sense. This is simply about what it means to be a creature, to be a finite being, one who is subject to both coming into and out of existence. And that's where we get the common language you might see of holiness as being set apart. The way in which something is set apart as holy is to ritually transfer it from the realm of the common, or the everyday, or the world of decay and death, and to devote it to Yahweh. The word that we'll see in the text for this ritual transfer is consecration, or alternatively, sanctification. To make something or someone sacred, to devote whatever that thing or that time or that place is for the purpose of recapturing the original design of creation. The Leviticus scholar Mary Douglas gives us another view of holiness. Quote, "Holiness means keeping distinct the categories of creation. It therefore involves correct definition, discrimination, and order." End quote. You'll notice that language of distinction being the same as we just saw from Leviticus 10:10. And the biggest concentration of times where that Hebrew word appears is in the creation narrative, all in the first 3 days of creation. Looking all the way back to that episode in the beginning of season 1, we discussed how creation meant 2 things. Number 1, to put things in order. Number 2, to fill them with life. And how the first 3 days of creation were about the first, putting things in order or making distinctions. And I think this is really important that we grab onto this, because making distinctions and discriminating or defining, when done well, creates a kind of wholeness that is neither full oneness nor full plurality. That wholeness is the unity which holds together the diversity, which, by the by, reflects the very nature of God himself, 3 in 1. Mary Douglas goes on, quote, "To be holy is to be whole, to be one. Holiness is unity, integrity, perfection of the individual and of the kind." End quote. Couple of observations there. One is that unity does not preclude diversity, but also to look at that wholeness or perfection. I just want us to remember this is not about moral perfection primarily. That is certainly one category of how holiness can be achieved, but it is by no means the sole or even the primary meaning. What it means in total is to bring things back to their proper state of wholeness, to revivify, to bring the life of Adonai into the everyday world, and to make distinctions that unify. One last aspect of holiness we're going to look at comes to us from the Leviticus scholars Baruch Levine and Jonathan Klawans. They talk about holiness as being about things which belong to God, or to God's realm of existence. Things which are holy, or people which are holy, are consecrated into a special relationship with Adonai. And the nature of that special relationship is one of ownership. That is why holiness basically means belonging to Yahweh, not belonging to him as slaves. That is the relationship that the ancient Near East gods had with their servants. And Adonai is not like those gods. But belonging here means belonging as sons, where the service, which is then given within the sacred space, is not about bowing or scraping or abasing oneself or appeasing an angry deity. The service is about reclaiming one's divine inheritance. But remember the garden and the first fall. We never get that inheritance on our own terms, lest we be like the prodigal son. But even then, Adonai will welcome us back with open arms. So let's do a summary of what holiness is. Holiness is 3 concepts, overlapping and interweaving with each other. 1, the eternal and infinite life of Yahweh. 2, the ownership of Yahweh. 3, the perfection or completion or wholeness of Yahweh. So to consecrate or to sanctify or to make holy means to transfer some person, object, or period of time from the realm of the everyday and common, that which is part of the fallen creation and is passing away, and to devote it to the realm of the eternal, to stamp it as belonging to Yahweh. And within that transfer of ownership and usage, to restore that thing or person back to its original creational design, wholeness and well-being, or in one Hebrew word, shalom. So, if that's holiness, what's on the other side of the coin from holiness? The term the biblical authors give to this is common. And that raises a question, like, is being common a bad thing? Because holy is certainly a good thing. Well, I mean, that kind of depends on what we mean when we ask that question. Because being common is not about moral failure or guilt, frankly, any more than being holy is about moral goodness or lack of guilt. There is no sense of ethical or legal condemnation for being common. Now, just to be clear, this is not one of those basic kind of things. This is just a recognition of one's status before Adonai as a creature, one who is utterly dependent upon him for every breath that we take, one who possesses nothing on our own terms, one who is fragile and frail and fallible. With that in mind, I do want to say that there is a sense of what we might call not rightness associated with being common. Now, when I say not right, I mean that in the sense of creation, of tov and ra. Sort of like when Adonai makes human, he looks at the man and says, it is not tov for the man to be alone. So he makes Adam whole, paradoxically by splitting him in half, and then by bringing him back together again. And that's one of the reasons why marriage has been viewed as a sacrament by the historical church. Because in marriage, the splitting in two of humankind is made whole again. Man and woman become one flesh, and that sanctifies the state of not rightness that exists when they are apart. It's taking what is not right and putting it back together. Or, to use a biblical term, justifying a state of affairs that is fallen and broken, putting it back into proper order and filling it with life by the means of recreating. Now, by calling man and woman apart as being not right, am I saying that singleness is a sin? Of course not, because not right does not equate to sinful. It does concern sins broadly as a result of the first fall and everything connected to it, but this is not about personal moral failure or guilt. Every fallen condition has the potential to be consecrated and sanctified, at least every condition that is not in and of itself sinful. And so one way of thinking about the term common is just simply to say fallen, to not belong to Adonai, or to not be filled and suffused with his life, to be in some way or other not totally whole and complete the way that you were created to be. Here is one other term we often see in the text of Leviticus, the term abomination. And there is a difference there between common and abomination. So think of it sort of like a spectrum. Just like there are degrees of holiness that is not an on-off switch state, there is such a thing as most holy. There are also degrees of not holy. On one end of the spectrum, we have the common, the ordinary, the not right, and perhaps fallen, but also not bad. And then we have sinful, which is certainly bad. And of course, that is reflected in the etymology of the term sin, which means missing the mark. Sin is something which is also not right, but within this not rightness, there is a degree of choice and agency attached to it. So moving on down the spectrum from sin, we move into abomination. That is where we see no goodness detected. These things are not just common, not just sinful, but actively and flagrantly in open rebellion. Things and people which are firmly opposed to the life of Adonai. Instead of being marked by him, they're marked as being owned by the sin beast. And they live in a state of utter and complete fragmentation, deliberately and intentionally. I think it's really important that we get all these distinctions correct, because there is a practice that I have witnessed in the church known as sin leveling. In this practice, it treats all sin as equal. You might hear it in phrases like, well, we're all sinners, or there but for the grace of God go I, or which of us can judge? Within this practice, we also see all the consequences of sin being treated the exact same. Within the penal view, which has been our frequent foil for both season 1 and season 2, the single consequence that every sin receives is death, despite rampant evidence within the Bible to the contrary. But on a practical lived reality level, this sin leveling practice will look at the consequences of sin purely on the vertical dimension, only with God. And it will entirely or functionally entirely ignore the horizontal dimension of the consequences of sin. This is where we hear phrases from people like, well, God has forgiven him, why can't you? Or everything she did is covered by the blood, so it doesn't matter anymore. This is simply not the picture of holiness which we find in Leviticus. In Leviticus, we see a robust and complex gradation of greater and lesser, both in the case of being holy and in the case of being common. Holiness is often not about morality at all. and it's certainly not about guilt in most cases. And because that is true for holy, that is also true for the state of being common. Let's not talk about this in the abstract. Let's take a look at some case studies. To begin with, the Sabbath. Quote, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a holy Sabbath of solemn rest to Adonai. End quote. Here is the command to treat the seventh day as sacred, where it has been set apart from all the other common days. This consecration of one day is a reflection of the creational design and pattern for time itself, where Adonai is saying, all time belongs to me, but set apart one day of the week to give back to me from the gifts that I have given you, to mark this one day as uniquely mine. And by designating one part of time as holy, all times are in some sense suffused or shadowed with that same holiness. Now, of course, they are not holy in the exact same way. The Sabbath is still special, but sort of in the first fruits mentality. That is ultimately what rest from labors means, to make sacred the results of all of our hard work. And it's super important that we understand that in designating a single day as holy, Adonai is not telling the people, stop doing work as an arbitrary rule. This is something that is built into the fabric of humankind and reflects the heart of Adonai toward us. Like Jesus told the Pharisees, quote, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, end quote. That's one of the reasons why the Jewish people saw the Sabbath commandment as a gift, a mitzvah, not just the gift of a period of rest and recovery, for sure, yes, but also a reminder of the ultimate reality of our dependence on God for everything. The principle of wisdom is timeless, and it still remains that what we should be doing is filling this space-time of death and entropy and decay with the eternal and unchanging life of Adonai. To remember Adonai's ownership of all time by stamping some time as uniquely belonging to him, and to reflect on the biblical truth that a whole or complete use of the time we have been given is one which has both work and rest. Here's another case study to consider about holiness. The tabernacle itself, the designated and consecrated space that is set apart as holy to Yahweh. And in fact, the remainder of Exodus from 35 all the way through chapter 40 details the blueprints and the building of this tabernacle. And here again, we see the same principle where there are degrees of holiness. We have the outer courtyard. There is the sacrificial altar within that courtyard. Further in, we have the tent of meeting, also called the holy place. And then behind the curtain or the veil, we have the Holy of Holies. The further in one goes, the more of the life of heaven that person encounters. And as a result, the more purity they are required to maintain to be able to enter in safely. Now, a quick little rabbit trail here that I think can be really important to debunk. Very often, I have heard in the Christian world that all that business about holy spaces, holy place is all over now. That was just something that Jews and pagans did, but we all know now that God doesn't live in a building because he lives in our hearts. So there's no more need for holy spaces. I would like to submit that that is a very disenchanted worldview of creation that is foreign to the Bible. And I'm just going to be honest here. Frankly, it's hard to take that seriously because it was always true that Adonai cannot be confined to a single location, that he is everywhere, filling all things, and he doesn't dwell in the tabernacle as if he is there and nowhere else. The tabernacle, or the later temple, is just a particular holy space where the life of God is uniquely and most concretely manifested. That doesn't make everything else be equally common. But to return to the tabernacle, we also see this principle of holiness be applied to the furniture within the tabernacle, such as the altar. Quote, 7 days you shall make atonement for the altar and consecrate it, and the altar shall be most holy. whatever touches the altar shall become holy. End quote. Here we see a principle, what we might perhaps call contagious holiness. Think of it this way. And here I am quoting my good friend Phil Bray, who I will have on in a later podcast episode as one of my expertise. Whenever holiness encounters impurity, holiness wins. That principle will become extremely important when we see Jesus walking around on earth in the flesh. His body acts as a kind of mobile altar or temple, like he described in John 2. And whatever he touches is purified and becomes consecrated. But to return to Exodus, notice that the atonement is made for the altar. Here again, this is a hint that we will unpack later, that atonement is not about removing guilt. It is about cleansing impurity, restoring the proper relational order between people and or things. And speaking of things, there are several objects in the tabernacle which are said to be holy. Quote, when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary as the camp sets out, after that the Kohathites shall come to carry these, but they must not touch the holy things, or they will die. End quote. Here the text is describing all the accoutrement inside the tent of meeting. The ark of the testimony, the table of the presence, the menorah, the altar of incense, and the utensils which are used in all of the above. We also see the same holy things language used with the flesh of the sacrifices that can only be eaten at certain times, in certain ways, by certain people, and in certain places. Because all these holy things, so to speak, carry the life of Adonai inside them. They are no longer ordinary or common objects. This is not just wood and gold and meat. To touch or to look on them, let alone to consume them, is to die. Not as Adonai saying, "How dare you," and smiting them, but sort of like an electrified fence or a lump of plutonium. And this, of course, informs the later Christian understanding of holy things, such as holy water, the Eucharist, or church buildings themselves. None of those things are magical in and of themselves, nor are they just bread and wine and water and wood. In the case of the holy things, ordinary and everyday stuff gets infused by the life of heaven. The energies of the divine and eternal and unchangeable are communicated to those objects. Sort of like when we have a branding iron and we put it into the fire. The energies of fire are carried by the branding iron. And because of that, if we're wise, we have to handle with care. So if someone just says, meh, it's just iron, there's nothing special about it, they're functionally denying the power and the reality of the divine. And also, as a side note, acting quite foolishly, because making that choice means you'll get burned in direct proportion to the quantity of holiness or pure, unadulterated life that resides within that thing. But not just in things, but also in people. Quote, speak to all the congregation of the Israelites and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, Adonai your God, am holy. End quote. The Israelite community or assembly were to be set apart from all the nations of the earth, to do, look, act, and be different than all the rest of those nations. If, as we've been talking about, holiness equals life, this means set yourselves apart from death. And that is what all the purity regulations are about. More on that next episode. But for now, I want to point out that here too, like before, there are degrees of holiness. The native Israelites are called to be more holy than the sojourners, even though both are all part of the assembly of Israel or the family of Abraham. The Levites were called to be more holy than all the other tribes. Aaron was called to be more holy than all the other Levites. In number 6, it tells us that there is a certain vow that any ordinary Israelite can take called a Nazirite vow that makes them more holy than other people. In all of these cases, the same principle is being activated as before. These people are being infused with the life of Adonai. They are set apart as uniquely belonging to Him, and through their actions are reflecting His wholeness and completeness in their very being. And because of that, they are treated differently and are expected to behave differently. Like we talked about before, this is both a holy blessing and a holy burden. Or, to quote Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility. This complexity tells us why the question we hear all the time about is this a sin or not is just far too simplistic. Because any given act can be a sin for some people and not for others, based on their degree of holiness, because of the blessing and the burden they bear. The entirety of the Holiness Code, which is the whole second half of Leviticus, describes what this looks like in daily life and practice. But here's the kicker. Those commandments cannot be cut and pasted into today's context, into every single individual. The Holiness Code is a unique Torah specifically for holy people. And I will admit, understanding this severely muddies the waters when we're talking about things like biblical morality, because that makes it next to impossible to find Kantian deontological principles that are universally true and applicable in every single circumstance. Biblical wisdom is much more complex and requires much more discernment because it depends on the degree of holiness being ascribed to that person or that thing. And to go back to our episode about the golden calf, I would argue that this fact undercuts the entire logic of Christian nationalism because the nation has to be holy in order to be Christian. And we have no indication that this is the case for America, because holiness is a status that is conferred, not one that is gained or that you can attain to. Holiness is not a destination to strive toward. It is a destination that we are transported into. And from that destination, we are called to protect and preserve that holy condition. And that is why the holier than thou approach entirely misses the point, because one does not achieve holy status. One is given holy status by a holy God, which is both a tremendous blessing and a tremendous burden, because the consequences are dire and severe. Remember what we said last time. Adonai offered the easier path. Moses rejected it, preferring the presence in their midst. Now that they have it, they must be pure in order to remain holy. And that will be the content of next week's episode.
Why don't you explain this to me like I'm 5?
Okay, ready? The family of Abraham is holy because God has infused their common lives with His heavenly life, because God has purchased and dedicated them to Himself, and because they reflect the wholeness or completeness of God, if, that is, they can follow His Torah with all their hearts. So, my challenge to you is to start seeing the sacred in common things. To put it another way, to re-enchant your worldview. With time, for example, set aside a Sabbath to rest and recover from your labors. This is a gift from our loving Father, because He made us and knows we are dust. He wants us to remember that and to remember our dependence on Him. Or perhaps to consecrate the spare or extra time that we do have by dedicating or devoting it to things that bring life and wholeness, not things that fragment and separate, or which bring a slow decay and eventual death of either body or spirit. Or perhaps you can see the sacred in places by doing things like treating holy places and spaces with reverence and respect. It is not just a building or bricks and mortar. When something is holy, it is infused with the life of heaven. And yes, it is true. There still are designated holy spaces, but it's also true that all things are holy to some degree. One way you can activate that is through the awe and wonder of nature. It is, in fact, that beauty that is healing. We often think of holiness as being dangerous, and it is, but it is also a blessing. It's kind of a high risk, high reward proposition. And that's kind of what we should expect, because all healing from trauma will be risky. So ask, seek, and knock, and look reverently for the beauty of holiness all around us. But also try to take a look at the holiness of things. Perhaps the next time you take communion at your church, make sure that you take it in a worthy manner. That's not about having unconfessed sins or sinfulness. In fact, that's precisely what the body and blood are there for, to eradicate and consume sin. Like we said earlier, when holiness comes into contact with impurity, holiness wins. When I talk about taking communion in a worthy manner, I mean without flippancy, with mindful attention. But beyond this, really reflect and be aware of what other things you functionally treat as holy, even if they aren't, and reserve that holy status and holy devotion to God and the things He has designated alone, not to a nation, not to a flag. But I suppose the biggest challenge I would give you is about people, because every human being is some degree of holy, precisely because we are all the image of the holy God. Certainly, there are degrees of this, based on how much that person has cultivated and protected their holy blessing as well as holy burden. But no human is common. That is why objectifying anyone, either in our hearts or in our daily lives, is a grave sin. Treating anyone as a means to our own ends is treating the holy as common. So perhaps consider that in your interactions online. Think, what if I approach this person like an ancient Israelite approached a priest? What if I treated this person like I would treat Jesus? Not as a commandment or a condemnation to you, but as a mitzvah to you. That is ultimately my hope, that we will all learn to see God in all things. Because, quote, from one ancestor he made all peoples to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God, and perhaps fumble about for him and find him. Though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. End quote. Everything is holy, because Adonai, who made all things, is holy. And that's where I'll leave you today. On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. If you find this content either enjoyable or important, please hit the like button and/or subscribe on whatever platform you listen to. Of course, ratings, reviews, and sharing with others is the best way to increase visibility and ensure that more people hear or see this content. If you have questions or want to engage in dialogue, leave a comment on that platform. Alternatively, you can leave a voice message on SpeakPipe, and I will add it to the Q&R episodes at the end of the season. Finally, just one last word to everyone. I don't know your story, but I know the one who is walking with you in your story. I know that He loves you. He made you for a purpose, and that His plan for you is always better. If you have been hurt by the church, I am sorry for the ways in which we have borne the name in vain. That is our responsibility to repair and repent. I hope that this podcast starts you on your own journey to find resurrection on the other side of deconstruction. My prayer for you is the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.